All right, Logic fans, what's up? Welcome to our third video on section 5.6. So this is 5.6c, and we're continuing to look at some more difficult examples of sentences which you can translate. So, imagine we ended with this one last time. We covered that. This one's slightly different, okay? This one, its main connective is the disjunction. The main connective of this one is not, the arrow here. The main connective is this. So this quantifier is ranging over the entire sentence. Okay, so we looked at constructions like this in chapter 4. Now, let's think for a minute about what this expansion might look like with one object, two objects, and three objects. Okay, we're going to walk through this nice and easy together. But this is where expansions really come into their own. If this were a premise or a conclusion of an argument that you were trying to demonstrate to be invalid, how do you know what to make true and what to make false in order to make the sentence true or false? Well, the expansion is really going to help you with that. So let's do the first one together. Expanding it with one object. So here's our sentence, okay? And let's just think about this for a second. What I want you to do is I want you to peel this quantifier off and ignore this one for now. Just leave it there as is. Okay, so if you have one object, it says everything is such that it satisfies this description. So if there was just one thing and you were just worried about this quantifier, what would that end up looking like? Pause now. Okay, well, basically what it's going to look like, okay, is this. This is going to be A. Okay, so all I've done here is I've peeled off this quantifier and I've left this one right here. Okay, I haven't touched that at all. It says everything satisfies this big whole description. So if I've got one object, that means A is going to satisfy, the object A is going to satisfy this whole description. So if A is F, then this whole thing holds. And now it's a lot easier. So if A is F, then at least one thing is G. And if I've only got the one object, right, then it's pretty straightforward to see how this is going to work out, right? It's just going to be, oh, at least one thing is G, so I've only got the one object. It's going to be like this, right? So our answer to the first one is going to look like that. Now, can you go ahead and expand this same sentence using two objects? Pause now. All right, let me give you a little bit of a hint here. So here's our sentence that we're trying to expand with two objects, okay? And I've got two possible expansions for the first step where all we're doing is we're peeling off the x quantifier and we're going to leave the y quantifier alone for now, okay? I could either expand it to this expression or I could expand it to this expression. Which of the two is correct? Only one of them is. Pause now and see if you can figure that out. All right, this one is the correct one. Follow-up question, can you figure out why that one is the correct one? Pause now. Okay, so this is going to be the correct way to expand this sentence with two objects. Okay, we're just getting rid of this quantifier to start with. And you know to go to this one because look at this sentence. On this sentence, the main connective is the arrow. And that makes a little bit of sense because you're seeing an arrow here, right? But the main connective of the sentence you're expanding is universally quantified. And when we're expanding universal quantifiers, we go to and. So when you have a universally quantified sentence that you're expanding, it's going to be an and, all right? So everything satisfies this description. So A satisfies that description and B satisfies that description. Okay, see if you can finish it from there. So here we are here. Okay, this is our expansion so far. Can you finish it from there? Pause now. Two objects. Okay, this is going to be pretty straightforward, right? So what you're going to have is at least one thing is G. So either A is G or B is G, right? Pretty straightforward. So it's going to look like this, okay? And then you're basically going to have the exact same thing on the right-hand side, except it's going to be if FB, right? So it's going to look just like that, okay? And this is what our expansion of that sentence is going to look like with two objects, okay? Now, Big Kahuna, can you expand this sentence with three objects, okay? And hopefully the pattern now is going to make some sense to you. What would it look like? Pause now. Okay, so hopefully you can see it, okay? But what you're going to end up with is something that looks exactly like this, except you're going to have an OR GC here. So that and this, I'll write it this way to make it perhaps the clearest it can be. And these are going to be B, this is going to be C, and we're going to have our OR GC here. And let me take a look at that to make sure I've done everything correctly. And yeah, this is what an expansion of this sentence would look like, okay, with three objects. So it would be this thing and this thing and this thing. This sentence, recall, right here, this sentence basically just says, okay, pick anything you like out of Santa's bag, A, B, or C. They all satisfy this description, right? So A is such that if it's F, then at least one thing in the domain is this way, right? At least one thing is G. Similarly, since it's everything, B is going to be that way too. If B is F, then at least one thing is that way. And if C is F, then at least one thing in the domain is G, okay? And that's exactly what an expansion of that type would look like, okay? Now, if I change this slightly, just to give you an example, okay? Suppose I change this to include the existential quantifier, but I left everything else the same, okay? See if you can figure out how that would change these solutions, all right? Pause now. Okay, well, the first one wouldn't change much, right? It would just stay the same, okay? But when you get two objects, something interesting happens. The main connective is no longer going to be and, it's going to be or, okay? And the exact same thing is going to happen here. Furthermore, if I were to change this to the universal quantifier, how would that change things? Pause now. All right, if that changed the universal quantifier, then every single one of these would become an and, okay? So it would end up looking just like this. Let's go through and do it. It would be these ones that's shifting, right? So it's kind of a nifty idea, and hopefully you're extrapolating the patterns and you can see all of the ideas. There's plenty of examples in the textbook, so make sure you're doing those and doing the exercises as well to really make sure you're getting this down. Let's look at an example where you have to, or where it would behoove you, or it would sort of pay to use expansions in order to demonstrate that an argument is invalid. Okay, so in particular, let's start with an argument that's pretty simple so you can see the big idea. So you might not need to use expansions to demonstrate that this easy looking argument is invalid. It is invalid. Your task is to provide an interpretation that demonstrates it to be invalid. But let's just suppose that you weren't really sure how to fill things in here and look at how using expansions can help. So suppose you're supposed to demonstrate this argument is invalid using three objects. The first thing you can do, okay, is you can expand each of the premises and the conclusion on three objects. So that's what we're going to do first. So this is no longer how many things we're using. This is premise 1, this is premise 2, and this is the conclusion 3, okay? So expand this with three objects, and expand this with three objects, and expand this with three objects, and do that right here. Pause now. Okay, so hopefully you came up with something like this. And look, now it's much easier than looking at this. So obviously some of you are going to be able to just look at this and know how to fill in the interpretation that demonstrates invalidity, right? An interpretation where all the premises are true and the conclusion is false. But if looking at this was hard, sometimes it can help to expand it out. You were asked to do it in three objects. So this is premise 1 expanded, premise 2 expanded, and the conclusion expanded. And now, instead of looking at this, you can just look at this and say, okay, how can I make this false and these things true, right? Well, in order to make this false, I just need at least one of these to be false because it's conjunctions, right? So let's suppose we had C lacking the property G, then this whole thing would be false. That's nice. We need at least one thing to have the property F, right, in order to make this true. So I don't know, maybe we'll make B have the property F. Okay, so far I've got this being false, right? So maybe I'll mark that in red for you just to sort of chart our work. And now I've got this thing being true. And look at how much easier it is to make a sentence like this true, right, than it is maybe just looking at that or just looking at this and trying to make it false, right? It's helpful. But now I've got to make this whole thing true, okay? Now, it's a bunch of conjunctions, so each conjunct has to be true, right? So one way to make the A one true is pretty easy, and I can make the C one true like that. But for the B one here, I've got this being true, so I better make that true as well. And this is going to be in an interpretation where all the premises are true and the conclusion is false of this argument, right? So looking at the expansions can really help a lot with developing invalidity demonstrations or tableau demonstrations of invalidity, okay? And so that's one of the really nice payoffs of learning how to do expansions is you can get these really concrete sentences to look at rather than the quantified ones. And again, it's not that the quantified sentences mean exactly this. They don't. It's just a model of what they might look like with three objects, okay? Let's have a look at an argument with a more complex, premise and conclusion so that you can really see why we might want to expand to facilitate developing interpretations that demonstrate invalidity. In this case, you might be able to come up with an interpretation that demonstrates invalidity without expanding. If you can, great, go ahead and do that. But you may very well need to expand first, and so we're going to do it in three objects for practice. And so go ahead and expand the premise and the conclusion, and then we'll develop the argument. So do the expansions now. Pause. Okay, so hopefully now you've got an expansion like this, okay, in the three objects, all right? And now you can really see why it might help to actually be looking at sentences like this rather than a sentence like this for demonstrating invalidity. So now that you've got this, provide an interpretation where all the premises, there's just one in this case, are true and the conclusion is false. Pause now. Okay, well, things are really nice, right? Because in the conclusion, I've got this and statement, so I just need to make one of the conjuncts false. Okay, so let's go ahead and make this one false. That means I'm going to have a true antecedent, right? And then I'm going to have a false consequent, which means every single one of these is going to have to be false because of the disjunctions, right? So I'm going to have to make sure that A has the property G. I'm going to have to make sure that B has it. I'm going to have to make sure C has it, okay? And what we've achieved is to make this false, thereby making the entire conclusion, which is a big conjunction, false, okay? That's nice. Now what we've got to do is make all the premises true. There's just one to worry about. Fortunately, it's a disjunction. So we only need one of them to be true. Well, the easy thing to do there is just to make the antecedent here, FA. If I make this false, this whole conditional is true. And if that whole conditional is true, this whole disjunction is true, right? So I've now made with all of that the one and only premise true. So this would be an interpretation in three objects that shows this argument to be invalid. Okay, and it would have been really hard to do it if you didn't expand, right? So that's just showing you one of the payoffs of learning how to expand. Okay, in the next videos, we're going to learn how to expand relation sentences. It's really important. And after that, in 5.8, we'll learn how to expand identity sentences. We'll see you on those videos.